The rough planks bit into her bare ankles, splinters already finding purchase in the raw skin above the chains. Dust motes danced in the meager light filtering through gaps in the barn wall, illuminating the faces of the men who stared, their eyes vacant or cruel, appraising her like cattle. She was a ghost in their world, a shadow of a child who had once known sunlight and open sky, now reduced to a price. The auctioneer's voice was a hateful buzz, assigning value to her bones, her fear, her very breath. Each word a fresh blow, stripping away another layer of the girl she was, leaving only a core of cold, defiant silence. She didn't understand their language, but the intention was universal. Ownership, dispossession. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and despair. Other captives stood near, faces etched with the same blank horror or simmering resignation. Some were women, some children, stolen from wagons or homesteads, their futures erased in the space of a few bids. Her own story was different, yet the end result was the same. The raid, the chaos, the burning lodges, the long march, the cold, the hunger, and finally this degradation. Her gaze swept across the faces, searching instinctively for a threat, for a weakness, for anything that might offer a chance. It lingered on a man standing slightly apart from the others, near the back. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the brim of a dark hat. He didn't lean or fidget like the rest. He simply watched. There was a stillness about him, a quiet intensity that set him apart. He wasn't leering. His eyes, when he finally tilted his head just so, were the color of a stormy sky, deep and unreadable. They seemed to look through her, past the dirt and the chains, to something else she couldn't fathom. A chill, unrelated to the draft from the barn door, prickled her skin. He raised a hand, a small gesture, almost imperceptible. The auctioneer droned on, a number was called out, and the man in the dark hat nodded. A gruff voice announced the price. $7. $7 for the last vestige of her freedom, for the life she had lost. A wave of humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over the cold defiance. $7. Less than they paid for a good horse. Laughter rippled through the crowd, a sound that made her teeth clench. The auctioneer grinned, a gap-toothed leer that promised nothing but misery. The man in the dark hat stepped forward. He didn't approach her directly. He spoke briefly to the auctioneer, his voice low, resonant, carrying an authority that silenced the snickering. Then he turned and walked towards her. His boots crunched on the straw and dirt. He stopped before her, looking down. His face was scarred, lines etched around his eyes and mouth like a map of hard country. There was no pity there, but also none of the open contempt she had grown accustomed to. His gaze was assessing, considering, like he was looking at a tool or a problem to be solved. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but to the chains. A man with keys followed him, fumbling with the lock. As the heavy metal shackle fell away from her ankle, she felt a jolt, not of freedom, but of terrifying uncertainty. She was no longer owned by the market, but by this man with the storm-colored eyes, whose purpose remained a mystery, and in whose gaze she sensed a dangerous, unspoken intent that twisted in her gut like cold steel. He didn't say a word to her, not a name, not an instruction. He simply turned and walked towards the barn door, a silent expectation hanging in the air. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her legs stiff, unused to bearing her full weight without the drag of the chains. Then, driven by an instinct honed by survival, she followed. The sunlight outside was blinding, sharp and unforgiving. The journey began under a sky vast and indifferent. He rode a sturdy roan. She walked beside him, dust rising in hazy clouds with every step. Her legs ached, her feet, unused to shoes or rough ground, protested with every mile. He set a steady, relentless pace, never looking back, never offering a hand. He seemed a part of the landscape, as unforgiving and silent as the wind that whipped across the plains. Hours bled into days. They spoke little. He would signal with a nod or a hand gesture, indicating when to stop, when to move. Once, when her steps faltered and she stumbled. He reined in the horse, not dismounting, but simply waiting, his gaze level. There was no impatience in his eyes, only a quiet observation that felt both unnerving and strangely devoid of malice. She watched him constantly, her senses sharp, alert to every shift in his posture, every glance towards the horizon. He was capable. He knew the land, how to read the sky, how to find water in places that looked barren. He hunted with an economy of movement, silent and precise. He built fires quickly, efficiently, cooking simple meals of game or salt pork. He ate in silence, offering her a portion with a look that brooked no refusal, but held no warmth either. It was the provision of an owner ensuring his property remained functional, yet there was a stark, almost respectful lack of unnecessary interaction. At night, he would unroll his bedroll a short distance away. He slept lightly, she could tell, waking at the slightest sound. She slept little herself, curled into a ball, the fear a knot in her stomach, but also a growing curiosity. What did he want with her? He hadn't laid a hand on her in anger, hadn't sold her on at the next town they skirted. He hadn't even tried to speak her language, though she sometimes heard him muttering words she didn't understand, sounds that were rough and unfamiliar. He was a puzzle, a collection of contradictions, capable, solitary, silent, and possessing that unsettlingly calm gaze. Her initial terror slowly began to yield to a different kind of fear, laced with bewilderment. He wasn't cruel in the ways she had braced herself for. The men at the auction, the traders, they had been openly predatory or dismissive. He was neither. He was simply their constant, watchful presence. It was like being owned by the mountain itself, indifferent, powerful, demanding nothing but acknowledgement of its existence. This lack of expected cruelty was its own form of disquiet, leaving her constantly anticipating a shift, a reveal of the true, terrible purpose she was sure he harbored. One evening, huddled near the fire, she watched him clean his rifle. The metal gleamed in the firelight. He handled it with practiced ease, each movement deliberate. His focus was absolute. In that moment, she saw not just a man, but a force, honed and ready. It reinforced the sense of hidden purpose. Why had he bought her? For $7. The pittance price still stung, a symbol of her worthlessness in their eyes. But perhaps in his eyes the value was not in what she was, but in what she represented or what he intended to make her a part of. The thought was terrifying, but it also contained a sliver of possibility. If she was a part of his plan, perhaps she could, in some small way, influence it. Resilience, buried deep, began to stir, a faint ember in the ashes of her despair. Survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about understanding the landscape, including the human one, and finding a way to navigate it. He was her landscape now. After many days, the terrain began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then steeper inclines, dotted with pine and scrub oak. They were heading deeper into isolated country. Finally, they arrived at a small, sturdy cabin nestled in a narrow valley, almost hidden from view. It was rough-hewn, built with care, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It looked like a place meant for endurance, for weathering storms both literal and figurative. This was where he lived, this solitary man who had bought her for the price of a worn saddle. The cabin was spare, clean, and filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. A single room with a hearth, a sturdy table, a bunk built into the wall. Tools hung neatly on the walls, traps, a shovel, axes. A small collection of books sat on a shelf, a surprising touch in this stark setting. He didn't offer her a place to sleep, simply gestured towards the floor near the hearth. It was warmer than the ground outside, a small, practical kindness that felt out of place. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire. He set about his chores, moving with the same quiet efficiency she had observed on the trail. He fetched water from a nearby spring, chopped wood, banked the fire. He didn't demand her help, didn't issue commands. It was as if her presence was a fact of nature, like the rock face behind the cabin or the stream flowing through the valley, something to be acknowledged but not fussed over. She watched him, still wary, but the sharp edge of panic had dulled, replaced by a vigilant observation and a growing sense of necessity. If she was to survive here, she needed to understand the rhythms of this place and the man who inhabited it. He cooked a simple stew that night, venison and root vegetables. It was the first truly warm meal she had eaten in a long time. He ate slowly, deliberately, his gaze often drifting towards the fire. She ate with a quiet urgency, the food a physical reassurance in the face of uncertainty. As she finished, he finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. Not her language, but English. He pointed to the dirty dishes. Clean, it was the first direct instruction, a word she understood through his gesture. She nodded, stood, and took the plates to a basin of water he had set out. The task was mundane, normal, a simple expectation of contribution. It was another small thing that chipped away at her preconceived notions of his intentions. He wasn't keeping her locked up, wasn't overtly threatening. He was integrating her into the practical necessities of his solitary life. Days turned into weeks. She learned his routines, the best way to gather firewood, the path to the spring, how to mend clothes with rough thread. He still spoke little, mostly in single words or short phrases related to tasks. Water, wood, food sometimes. Sleep now. He didn't teach her English deliberately, but she absorbed words through repetition and context. Her mind, sharp and adaptable, picking up the patterns. Her body grew stronger, the ache in her legs replaced by a steady resilience. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it had transformed into a constant vigilance, a readiness she now possessed not just instinctually, but with a dawning sense of self-possession. She was not just enduring, she was actively surviving. The man's silence, once a source of terror, now felt like a strange kind of space, allowing her own thoughts, her own strength to grow within it. She still didn't know his purpose, but she was no longer just waiting for it. She was living alongside it, gathering her own strength for whatever was to come. The change was subtle, slow, like the turning of the seasons in the valley. Her movements became less hesitant, more confident. She anticipated his needs, not out of servility, but efficiency. He noticed. His storm-colored eyes would watch her from across the cabin, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. One evening, he brought back a deer carcass, larger than usual. Without a word, he began skinning it. After a moment's hesitation, she approached, picking up a knife he had set aside, and began to help, mimicking his movements. He stopped, looking at her. A long moment passed. She met his gaze steadily, her own eyes reflecting the firelight, no longer filled with only fear, but a quiet determination. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Then he went back to work. It was a turning point. From that day on, they worked together, side by side, in a shared, wordless rhythm, butchering game, repairing the cabin, preparing food for storage. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with the sounds of their labor, the quiet language of two beings cooperating for mutual survival. He started leaving tasks for her, things she could manage alone, a quiet acknowledgement of her capability. He also began teaching her without formal lessons, pointing to plants, naming them in his rough English, showing her how to set a snare, how to track. His hands, large and calloused, were surprisingly gentle when demonstrating a delicate technique. One night, a storm raged outside, wind rattling the windowless openings, rain drumming on the roof. A primal fear, echoes of the raid, tightened her chest. She huddled by the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. He was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle again. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. He didn't say anything, but his gaze was steady, grounding. After a moment, he rose, went to a chest, and pulled out a thick, woven blanket. He walked over and placed it around her shoulders. It was warm, heavy. He didn't linger, just returned to his rifle. But the gesture, so unexpected, so devoid of demand or condition, broke something open inside her. A tiny crack in the wall of isolation she had built. She pulled the blanket tighter, feeling the unfamiliar warmth spread through her. She still didn't know the full extent of his purpose, the vengeance that had driven him to buy her. But she knew this much. He wasn't the monster she had expected. He was hard, yes, solitary, driven by something she didn't understand, but there was a core of something else there, something quiet and capable of an almost fierce protectiveness, perhaps of his solitude, perhaps of the life he had built here. And now she was a part of it. The fear of his hidden motive remained, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was tempered by this burgeoning, unspoken connection, built on shared silence, mutual capability, and the strange, unexpected warmth of a offered blanket in the storm. The man's name, she eventually learned through overhearing him mutter it while working, was Elias. He never offered it to her directly, and she had no name in his language to offer in return. She was simply girl in his rare commands, but increasingly, she felt like something more. Not a possession, but a presence. The turning point arrived not with a thunderclap, but the distant sound of riders. Elias froze, his head snapping up, listening. His posture shifted, becoming instantly coiled and dangerous. He moved to the window, peering out through a narrow gap. His face was grim. "Trouble," he murmured, a rare spoken thought. He began to move with rapid, purposeful efficiency, checking his rifle, gathering extra ammunition, securing the cabin. He didn't tell her to hide, didn't issue frantic orders. He simply moved, his actions speaking volumes. She understood instinctively. Threat. She went to the corner where he kept extra axes and selected a small, sharp one, hefting its weight in her hand. Elias glanced at her, pausing. His storm-colored eyes held a flicker of surprise. Then something else, a grudging acknowledgement. He didn't tell her to put it down. The riders approached slowly, deliberately. Not travelers, but men on a mission. She saw them through the cracks in the wall, rough-looking, armed, faces hard. They dismounted some distance away and approached on foot. Elias took up a position near the door, rifle ready. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice a low growl. She crouched behind the heavy table, axe ready. Her heart pounded, but there was no longer just fear. There was a fierce, protective instinct rising within her, not just for herself, but, unexpectedly, for this silent, scarred man who had given her shelter. The men called out harsh, demanding words. Elias didn't answer. They tried the door, found it barred, and began trying to force it open. The wood groaned. Elias waited, his breath steady. She watched him, the tension in his body, the absolute focus in his eyes. He was waiting for the right moment. When the door began to splinter, he acted. The rifle roared, deafening in the small cabin. A cry of pain from outside. Chaos erupted. More shots, splintering wood. Elias fired again, then moved back, reloading with practiced speed. The men outside were enraged, firing blindly at the cabin. One of them managed to get an arm through a gap and was fumbling with the bar. Elias was reloading, his eyes fixed on the door. Without thinking, driven by the same instinct that made her follow him from the auction, she scrambled forward, raising the small axe. She brought it down with all her strength on the arm fumbling with the bar. A guttural yell echoed outside. The arm withdrew. Elias looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise for a fleeting second, before his gaze returned to the door. He finished reloading. "Good," he said, the single word a shock in the cacophony. The attack faltered. The men outside, wounded and unsure, regrouped. They shouted threats, promises of return, before finally retreating, the sound of their horses fading into the distance. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Elias didn't lower his rifle immediately. He listened, waited, his senses still sharp. She remained crouched, axe in hand, trembling now that the immediate threat had passed, but also filled with a strange sense of power. She had acted. She had defended. Finally, Elias straightened, lowering the rifle. He looked at the splintered door, then at her. He walked over, taking the axe gently from her grasp. He looked at the blood on the blade, then back at her face, smudged with dirt and sweat, eyes wide and still bright with adrenaline. There was a profound depth in his gaze now, something that went beyond assessment or observation. It was recognition. "They were bounty hunters," he said, his voice quiet. "Looking for me," he paused, his gaze searching hers. "Because of what I did. To avenge someone." The word vengeance hung in the air, the purpose she had sensed from the beginning. But it wasn't aimed at her. He had bought her, brought her here, and in the process, perhaps without intending to, had built something unexpected. He turned away, looking out the damaged doorway at the quiet valley. "Guess my luck ran out," he murmured, more to himself than to her. But it didn't sound like despair. It sounded like a chapter closing. He turned back to her. "We can't stay here." It was a simple statement of fact, but it held a question, a choice. He didn't offer her gold or a ticket to somewhere. He offered the implied partnership forged in shared hardship and defense. He had sought vengeance, perhaps against those who had taken something from him, and had found this, a fierce, resilient girl who had faced down the darkness and emerged with fire in her eyes. She looked at him, this man who had bought her for $7, who had brought her to this place of quiet solitude and unexpected shared strength. She saw not an owner, but a fellow survivor, marked by the world, but not broken. She met his gaze, the storm in his eyes calm now, waiting. She didn't need to speak his language to answer. She nodded, a single, firm movement. Her choice was made. The world outside was still vast and dangerous, but she was no longer alone, no longer defined by the price on her head or the chains on her ankles. She was a girl forged in fire, standing tall beside a man who had sought vengeance but found, perhaps, the beginning of something like a future. Resilience wasn't just surviving the storm. It was finding the strength to walk into the sun afterwards, side by side with someone who understood the language of survival, spoken not in words, but in shared action and quiet, earned trust. They would leave this place, not as owner and owned, but as two souls who had found an unlikely harbor in each other's quiet strength.